Hello, today we are very excited to have talk with Samuel Gregg about his new book, The Next American Economy, Nation, State, and Markets in an Uncertain World. And you all know Sam because we've had him on the podcast and in Guatemala many times. But Samuel Gregg is Distinguished Fellow in Political Economy and Senior Research Faculty at the American Institute for Economic Research. He has a doctorate in philosophy, in moral philosophy and political economy from Oxford University. And some of his 16 books include Unordered Liberty, The Commercial Society, which has been translated into Spanish, Wilhelm Röpke's Political Economy, Becoming Europe, Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization, which is also translated, right, Sam?
It is.
Yes, and The Essential Natural Law. And two of his books have been shortlisted for Conservative Book of the Year. He has published many articles, and he is a member of many organizations, including the Mont Pelerin Society and the Philadelphia Society. And so welcome, Sam. We are very excited to see you. And
thanks, Carroll. It's good to be with you.
To talk to you about this book, which has been an incredibly successful book, hasn't it?
Well, so far, yes. I've been very gratified by the response that it's continuing to receive reviews. I'm still doing lots of podcasts, and this is, 9 months or more after the book first appeared, so I'm very grateful for that.
Yes.
But I suspect it has something to do with the fact that the topic of the book is very much on people's minds in the United States right now.
I wanted to ask you, who did you write this book for?
Well, the short answer to that is many audiences. But I suppose the primary audience here are those people in the United States, particularly on what you might call the political right, who are now in the process of having severe doubts about the place of free markets and capitalism more generally in the American experiment in ordered liberty. It's written for those who are tempted by things like protectionism and industrial policy, and that is a lot of Americans right now, both on the left and on the right. And it's also written for those who have not made their mind up about these types of questions, but who understand that the case for free markets and limited government today can't be exactly the same as it was articulated, say, in the 1980s, that we live in a different geopolitical and economic world. And the case for free markets and limited government has to be cognizant of that. As I often like to say, we're not living in the 1980s anymore. Ronald Reagan is not president. The culture of the United States is very different. And government has actually surged back into a great deal of activism in economic life in the United States today. So much so that there are now generations of people who don't know what it was like to live under the stagflation of the 1970s or the turn to markets that occurred in the 1980s and early 1990s. So we live in a different world, and I think it's always important for those of us who believe in free markets and limited government. We have to be cognizant that we have to remake the case for these things every generation. And that involves some updating, some changing, and some development in the way that we think about these things.
I really agree. And I think that the industrial policy is something that is not only in the United States, it's an issue here in Latin America as well, because we were counseled by the Economic Commission for Latin America to implement a lot of policies regarding industrialization, and we thought industrialization was going to be the key to our development. And I really like the way you go about explaining how these policies have in the long run not been very successful in several countries, including Japan and China.
Yes, that's right. And of course, industrial policy, as you said, was followed quite almost religiously so in a lot of Latin America, really from the 1950s onwards. In fact, let's call it national developmentalism, which was the way that this was described, was in many respects developed and refined by Latin American economists in the 1950s, some of whom were associated with what was called dependency theory.
Yes.
But generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that industrial policy is something, it's not new. It's in fact everywhere. But what's interesting about that is that when you look into the details of industrial policy, you see that not only does it fail at a theoretical level, and I spend some time in the book explaining the theoretical problems with industrial policy, such as the knowledge problem. It assumes perfect knowledge of the present and the future. But also practically speaking, there are lots of very good examples, and you mentioned some of them: Japan, China, Latin America, and a good number of European countries where industrial policy has been tried and has almost always failed to meet its expectations, and usually ends up being captured by regulators, by industry working with regulators, and it becomes a major means by which cronyism and even corruption starts to permeate economic and political life.
And it's a way of reintroducing the state into the economy and sort of micromanaging decisions in the economy. And you mentioned how resources are seriously misallocated. And then you mentioned how China sort of swerved away from the industrial policy and went into commercial policy and sort of a different strategy. And the liberalization that was experienced in China, even though it wasn't complete or even comprehensive, was very successful. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So as we all know, in 1978, the Chinese leadership, Deng Xiaoping in particular, after a visit to Singapore, decided that it was time to open up the Chinese economy to some competitive pressures and to liberalize, not totally, as you mentioned, but to liberalize parts of the domestic economy, particularly as agriculture. And much of this took place in the 1980s. So China moved away from, frankly, Maoist top-down control policies towards more room for economic liberty, both domestically as well as internationally. And there's no question that this took the Chinese economy from being one of the worst in the world to being a significant player on the international scene. But as I point out in the book, in 2008, really as a consequence of watching the financial crisis unfold in the United States, there was a definite shift away from that approach of liberalization that China had tentatively approached and embraced. And they instead started moving back towards more state control of the economy. And that has accelerated under Xi, who became party secretary, head of the military commission, and then president in 2012. And he's very much someone who believes that what use of industrial policy is a way for China to accelerate its economic development and also give the Communist Party and the Chinese state much more control over the economy. So it works both to cement economic centralization and political centralization, and those two things tend to go hand in hand. But already, even though China's National Institute of Statistics is basically releasing less and less information because they know things are going badly, that's what these regimes do, right? They stop releasing information when they know things are going badly. But even despite that limitation, we know that the Chinese economy is in some significant trouble, partly because of its demographic problem. They're now paying the price for its ludicrous one-child policy, which is now leaving them with an aging workforce, enormous healthcare problems lined up in the future, as well as the fact that a lot of young Chinese men are not going to have anyone to marry. That's a serious problem. But also, we're seeing evidence of widespread cronyism and corruption is flowing from these policies. We also know that it means that China's ability to continued to export its model, so to speak, through the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been very much used by a lot of Latin American countries, as you know. They've actually started to reduce the amount of money they've been pouring into that because it's not working. It's not delivering the economic returns that they thought it would. So industrial policy in China, let's call it industrial policy Chinese style, has not worked out so well for the Chinese regime. And I think that explains why they're having some significant and difficult to hide economic and political problems right now.
So in a way, this obsession with China that is evident in some of the debates in the United States, I think there's like this immense fear of China being the hegemonic power and taking over sort of the leadership in economic terms and around the world, that's dictating a lot of the protectionism that that people are promoting, isn't it?
Yes, the fear of China, concerns about China attaining economic ascendancy, certainly over the Asia-Pacific region, if not in other parts of South Asia and East Asia. That's a real fear on the part of Americans. It also flows into...
You're sort of saying it's sort of not justified.
I'm saying it's grossly exaggerated.
Okay.
So yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Because first of all, we know that the policies that they're using don't work. We know that. The second thing is there's lots of evidence coming out of China suggesting that they're having enormous problems. So, for example, there are entire cities in China that have no one living in them. Right? So they planned ahead for this great economic expansion in particular parts of the country, which hasn't happened. And in some parts of the country, they're actually bulldozing some of these cities because no one's ever going to live in them. And think about all the capital, both monetary and human, that was invested in building some of these things. I also think that it's the case that the more you centralize an economy, and this is, I think, the rule everywhere, the more you centralize an economy, the more inefficiencies emerge and are not dealt with. And also those in charge tend to be told what they want to hear, because no one wants to tell Xi that things are going badly. And that's the nature of these top-down centralized dictatorships. And when that happens, all sorts of bad things continue to fester beneath the surface. So I think that their demographic problem, which I think is going to handicap them severely going into the future, I think the industrial policy and let's call it the re-entry of the state into large parts of the Chinese economy is going to produce significant problems for them. So much so that I think that the saber rattling that China is engaging in, I think, is typical of regimes that have severe domestic problems. They tend to point people's attention outside the country to try and distract them from the unpleasant realities that they're living in right now.
You have a chapter on trade and international trade. U.S. is the most important trading partner for Guatemala, I know, for most Central American countries and many other Latin American countries. And the protectionist policies that have been implemented in the past are very harmful to our economies and to the possibility that we can sort of export our goods into the United States. How have people received your chapter on trade?
Well, let's put it this way. Those people who are protectionists or in favor of industrial policy do not like my book.
Okay.
They really don't like it. You can tell by the reviews that they write. They really don't like it. Now, so one has to ask, why is this the case? Well, I think it's the case because they're often informed by bad economics. They have a zero-sum view of trade. They think of protectionism as something that literally protects Americans, particularly American blue-collar workers, from competition from abroad. And there's also a long history, we forget this, there's a long history of protectionist policies in the United States. So between the end of the Civil War up until around about 1914, the United States embraced protectionist policies. Now, it's a big economy, so it can go for a long time, so to speak, without those policies having immediate effects. But Americans, I think, like a lot of other countries, in times of economic distress, they tend to shift in protectionist direction. So that's not a peculiarly American phenomenon. But I also think that what a lot of people who are in favor of protectionism in the United States don't understand is that protectionism not only doesn't achieve its goals, it also hurts Americans. So when America puts tariffs on, say, Guatemala or China or whoever, does it affect those countries? Yes, it certainly does. But it also increased costs for American consumers, all 330 million of them. It also damages particular industries that may not be the immediate beneficiaries of the protection, but are downstream, so to speak. So here's an example. When the Trump administration raised tariffs on steel, it's estimated that they saved about 6,000 American jobs in manufacturing. But it also cost 60,000 jobs downstream as a consequence of those companies and businesses that use steel suddenly found themselves having to pay more. And so how did they respond? Well, they used automation and they also let people go. So that's the problem from protectionism. As I often say to Americans, my fellow Americans, look, yes, you might be hurting other countries when you do this, but you need to understand not only are you hurting American consumers, you're actually hurting different parts of the American economy when it comes to jobs. And in the long term, you are rendering the American economy less competitive. And sooner or later, that will catch up with you. It might not happen immediately. It may not happen in 5 years or 10 years, but at some point, it will catch up with you. And if you don't have the sort of resilience that comes from being open and competitive, then you can experience very sudden and very devastating economic decline. And that's the thing I think about trade policy, right? Free markets and free trade are always about the long term. They're always about the long term. Protectionism and industrial policy is always about the short term.
It's the political economy equation, right? I think
absolutely.
It's government taking short-term and short-sighted decisions.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about ESG because this concern for the environment and social and governance, and thinking not of the shareholder but of the stakeholder in a firm, it's really taking hold of U.S. businesses and European businesses as well. But it's really, I think, affecting decision making in companies, and we've seen it in several examples recently regarding Pride Month. But it's a little scary for us looking from the outside.
Well, ESG, which of course stands for Environment, Social and Governance, is, in my view, simply a new version of what was called corporate social responsibility back in the 1990s and early 2000s. We go through these cycles where some business schools and some people working in business decide that profit is somehow not a sufficient goal for businesses, that businesses have to take account of the interests of different stakeholders. Now, every business, when it goes into a community, has to pay attention to the political, social dynamics around it, right? Because you'd be very foolish if you went into a country or a community and decided you were going to just ignore everything that was going on around you. So businesses have to pay attention to that sort of thing. So to an extent, every business has to pay attention to stakeholders. Otherwise, they'll go out of business. But the problem with ESG and what's called stakeholder theory is that they are basically proposing a completely different understanding of the nature of the corporation and the nature of business and the nature of commerce. They're really trying to alter what an Aristotelian would call the telos of business. That being the purpose, the end that defines the purpose of the commercial enterprise. And I often say to people, business is not a family. Family is not a business. The military fight wars. Families don't fight wars. The judiciary engages in upholding the rule of law. It's not the job of families to do that. In other words, every organization has a particular goal that defines everything else that it does. In the case of business, the purpose of business is profit and realizing economic value and shareholder value. Once it diverts from those goals and starts saying things like, well, we must take direct responsibility for the environment. We must support any number of fashionable social causes because that shows that we care about people, and that's what. And we need to appoint people to our boards who represent diversity, regardless of whether they're actually qualified to do the job or not. You start to see that the end goal of many of these schemes is to fundamentally transform business. And I think for some time, it has become certainly quite popular certainly in corporate America. But there's two things I'd point out that I think can give us some cause for hope. One is I think there's a lot of lip service that's given by companies to this. They use ESG rhetoric, but when you look at what they actually do, you discover that they actually haven't changed very much in terms of what they think their primary purpose is. So that's one thing. So I think some of them are basically waiting to see whether this trend goes away. And I think in some parts of the country it already is under a severe criticism, which brings me to my next point. ESG is under, I mean, you mentioned it's been very, very widespread in a lot of America now, and particularly business America. But there is enormous backlash going on across the political spectrum now against ESG because the bottom line with ESG is that you pay more by way of fees and get less in terms of return. So I will often say even the most left-wing, progressive, boomer trust fund baby living in New York at some point is going to be annoyed that their trust fund is not delivering as much in terms of income as they're expecting to. So, and also I think more and more people, when they look at ESG, they discover it's deeply incoherent. It's basically embrace of progressive political causes, which causes people to say, well, if that's the case, why aren't you embracing conservative political causes? And of course, that's when business people suddenly don't want to talk about ESG anymore. Also, the measurements that are used to judge whether ESG actually works. Turns out they're full of contradictions. There's no standardized measurements across the board that have been used. And it turns out that the measurements themselves are highly dubious. So the good news, I think, is ESG is very much under scrutiny right now. But the danger, I think, is in the long term, is that the government, particularly the federal government, will try and mandate this for businesses. And there's some evidence that the Securities and Exchange Commission and other semi-quasi-government organizations are already trying to do this. And that, I think, is the long-term fear, because if ESG requires the force of government mandate, then we're in a different world altogether.
And finally, I found this book sort of to be a continuation of The Commercial Society, because there you outline, and also your work on Wilhelm Röpke, because you outline how the market works, what a commercial society would look like, and in your last chapter, you sort of recommend that the United States go back to a commercial republic. Sorry. Do you think that's possible? Do you think it can happen?
Well, whether it's possible or not, we'll see. But I also think that if you care about free markets, if you care about liberty, if you care about limited government, if you care about civil society, I don't think America has any choice but to do that. Because the alternatives are to become something like a social democratic European quasi-market, quasi-welfare state, or to embrace crony capitalism, or to embrace the progressive vision of the United States, or to embrace this protectionist, inward, inward-looking approach to political economy in which the state, what I call state capitalism, becomes the norm. And the only alternative to that I think that preserves all those things that I said I think are certainly worth preserving and even growing is this idea of America as a commercial republic. And what's more, it's what America's founders wanted the country to be. That's very clear. If you go back and read the Federalist Papers, if you read George Washington's farewell address, there's no other way to read those documents than as documents recommending that America become a commercial republic. In other words, if America is going to be faithful to what it's supposed to be, then they need to embrace this idea of America as a commercial republic. And the commercial side, of course, is markets, entrepreneurship, competition, rigorous trade domestically, rigorous trade abroad with other countries. The republic part is the commitment to constitutionalism, the commitment to commercial virtues, the classical virtues, and religious virtues. All these things, I think, add up to what I mean by this idea of a commercial republic. And it's there very much in the vision of the founders for the United States of America. So I think that's where the political part or political economy comes into this equation. And those people in America who are free marketers, we're really good at explaining policy and why things work or don't work, but we're less good at addressing, let's call it the normative side of things, the moral, cultural side of things. And I think the idea of a commercial republic enables Americans to do that in a way that's faithful to the founding, but also is a vision that can very much take America forward in the 21st century.
Thank you so much, Sam. I think it's a vision for many other countries, not just the United States. I think it's something that would bring all of our economies greater well-being. So thank you very, very much. I hope our readers, our audience picks up your book. I hope it will be translated into Spanish sometime soon. That would be great. And we really enjoyed talking to you today.
Thanks for having me on, Carroll, and hello to all my good friends in Guatemala.
For more information regarding Instituto Fe y Libertad, its work activities, and what we've discussed in this episode, you can visit feylibertad.org, our sites on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.